Good morning. We are looking at physiology of oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so we'll start by looking at oxytocin, and then after that we'll look at antidiuretic hormone. The first part is introduction to oxytocin. So this hormone is secreted from the hypothalamus by what we call the paraventicular nucleus. Okay, a group of cell bodies located in the hypothalamus called the paraventicular nucleus. But it is also secreted by the supraoptic nucleus in small quantities, and it is transported from hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary through a nerve fiber of the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Hypophyseal means pituitary. That's why the posterior pituitary is called neurohypophysis, and the anterior pituitary gland is called the adenohypophysis. Okay, so oxytocin is associated with the paraventicular nucleus, but there are some small quantities secreted by the supraoptic nucleus. The supraoptic nucleus is associated with secretion of ATH. So what we are saying is that synthesis of oxytocin takes place in the hypothalamus, and then it is stored in the posterior pituitary gland. It's different from hormones of the anterior pituitary gland, where synthesis takes place there. Okay, for example, growth hormone, we say that synthesis of growth hormone takes place in the somatotropes. Synthesis of Prolactin takes place in the lactotrophs, okay, which is located in the anterior pituitary gland. But for these two hormones, oxytocin and ADH, synthesis takes place in the paraventicular nucleus in the hypothalamus, and then instead of it being transported in blood, it is transported by the axons, which we call the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So there is axoplasmic flow of ADH and oxytocin. Okay, this is what we are saying in the posterior pituitary. The oxytocin is stored in the nerve endings of the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So when suitable stimuli reach the posterior pituitary from the hypothalamus, oxytocin is released into the blood. Suitable stimuli like suckling will cause secretion of oxytocin. And oxytocin is secreted from both males and the females. Okay, so it's not only the female hormone, it is also a male hormone. So away from introduction, let's look at the chemistry of oxytocin. Oxytocin has a half-life of 6 minutes. We know what half-life is. This is a time required for a quantity of oxytocin to reduce to half of its initial value. Okay, half-life, we know it's used in nuclear physics, but we can also use it in pharmacokinetics, in pharmacology. So as a pharmacokinetic principle, half-life is defined as the time it takes for the concentration of the drug in the plasma or the total amount in the body to be reduced by 50%. So oxytocin is 6 minutes. And in terms of class, oxytocin is a peptide of 9 amino acids only. Okay, The sequence of these amino acids, we have cysteine, which is a sulfur-containing amino acid. We have tyrosine, we have asparagine, another cysteine. So these amino acids, they are held together by peptide bonds. Okay. The cysteine bridge forms a sulfur bridge. Oxytocin has a molecular mass of about 107 kilodaltons. Not kilodalton, 1007 daltons. So this is the oxytocin we are talking about. Okay, as you can see, it's similarly to arginine vasopressin. That's why in terms of action, arginine vasopressin also causes blood vessel constriction. Oxytocin also causes constriction of smooth muscle. Okay, they just differ in the location of the receptors. So this is the structure of oxytocin and ADH, which we are going to look at later. And then there's atosiban. It's also similar to these hormones. Okay. So that's about the chemistry of oxytocin. It's a peptide hormone because it's made up of amino acids. Now let's look at regulation. Regulation. So the major stimulus for oxytocin is suckling of the breast. Okay, it's there. That's a major stimulus. But there are also sight, sound, or smell of infants, meaning that there is a psychological component of oxytocin secretion. And then there's also dilation of the cervix during birth and during copulation. But the major inhibitors of oxytocin is opioids, the endorphins. Okay, so this is the regulation of oxytocin. Natural way of regulating oxytocin. Now I'll talk about the suckling reflex, what really happens, okay, for oxytocin to be secreted. There's a diagram here. This is called the suckling reflex, milk ejection reflex of oxytocin. These are typical physiology exam questions where I may be asked, describe the milk ejection reflex. Okay. Remember, a reflex always has a reflex arc. All reflexes, you have to identify the reflex arc components. You have to identify the receptors. You have to identify, first of all, before the receptor, there should be a stimulus receptor. You have to identify the afferent, that is the nerve fiber taking the information in form of action potentials to the integrating centers, which are called the centers, and then the efferent, and then a physiological response. Okay, so these are the components of any reflex, be it defecation reflex, be it vomiting reflex, pupillary reflex, and many other reflexes. At least you need to mention these components: the stimulus, the receptor type. Is it a pain receptor? Is it a chemical receptors? Is it a pressure receptors or touch receptors? Then you look at the A, which is the afferent, mainly sensory fibers. And then you look at the central receptor, not central, the centra, where there is interpretation of information. And then there is efferent, which brings the motor output, innervating either the muscles or the gland. And then we have a physiological response. Okay, so for this milk ejection reflex, a stimulus is here. Okay, stimulus, that is a baby suckling. Okay, and where are the receptors? The receptors are somewhere. They are located in the nipples and the areola of the breasts. Okay, these are called mechanoreceptors. They are sensitive to mechanical stimulus of a child. Or we can call them touch receptors. Okay, so they'll become depolarized and they'll initiate an action potential which will be propagated through this afferent fiber. Okay, so this afferent fiber is we can call it a somatic afferent nerve. Okay, somatic afferent nerve, which takes the information to the spinal cord first of all. Okay, to the spinal cord, and then from the spinal cord, the electrical impulse is relayed, or it ascends in the spinothalamic tract to the brainstem. Okay, and finally it reaches the paraventicular nuclei of the hypothalamus. And then the paraventicular nuclei of the hypothalamus will release the the oxytocin. And the oxytocin, once it is released, there's also communication with the posterior pituitary gland where there is further secretion of oxytocin. Okay, and then oxytocin will move in the bloodstream, and then it has its receptors on the breasts, the myoepithelial cells, and it will cause contraction and milk comes out. Okay, so the stimulus is a baby suckling. The receptors are located in the breast, the nipples, and the areola. Then once an action potential has been produced, it is traveled through the spinal cord and it ascends in the spinothalamic tract to the brainstem, specifically reaches the paraventricular nucleus. So the center is around the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. The efferent, the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, okay, becomes activated, transports the oxytocin to the posterior pituitary gland. And then there will be a release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so an oxytocin will be released in blood. Okay, we'll talk about this later. The actions will be released in blood and it will perform various actions. Okay, so this is a milk ejection reflex. So you should note that continuous suckling, okay, as the infant continues to suckle, there will be further stimulation and synthesis and transportation of oxytocin to the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, as the child is suckling, there will be synthesis going on. There will also be transportation of oxytocin from the paraventricular nucleus into the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, because the oxytocin which is in the posterior pituitary gland will be secreted, so there will be decrease in the level of oxytocin in the posterior. So the paraventricular nucleus should continue to synthesize and transport the oxytocin to the posterior pituitary gland. That's what we mean. So at the same time, there's this the suckling reflex. Okay, it's just important to know that the suckling reflex will inhibit the release of prolactin inhibitory hormone from the hypothalamus. So the suckling reflex will inhibit the production of prolactin inhibitory hormone, meaning that when prolactin inhibitory hormone has been inhibited, prolactin levels will increase. That's what we mean. So at the same time the child is suckling, there's increased levels of prolactin. Why is there increased levels of prolactin? Because this hormone from the hypothalamus that inhibits the secretion of prolactin from the lactotropes of the anterior hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, has been inhibited. Okay, so we also mentioned that dilation of the cervix also causes oxytocin secretion. How? So dilation of the cervix also causes oxytocin secretion. This is the one we are calling the Phagosome reflex. It is also called the Phagosome reflex. So apart from suckling reflex, dilation of the cervix results into secretion of oxytocin. So we can just run through it. Baby's head stretches the cervix and feedbacks on the pituitary. The pituitary secretes oxytocin into blood and travels to the uterine muscles. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contraction and pushes the baby down, stretching the cervix further. When the cervix is stretched further, the cycle repeats over and over until the child is born. So this is called the Phagosome reflex. So you can know that apart from childbirth, genital tract stimulation during coitus also increases oxytocin reflex. So the Phagosome reflex is a neuroendocrine reflex in which the fetal distension of the cervix, the fetal distension of the cervix will stimulate a series of neuroendocrine responses leading to oxytocin produced. Okay, so this one is straightforward. It's called positive feedback mechanism. So there's another factor we said oxytocin is also inhibited by endorphins. Okay, the endorphins, when they are released from the pituitary gland, that is in response to pain, they act on both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, they are released during conditions such as pain, so they act on both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the endorphins will bind to certain receptors. We call them the mu receptors, and they will inhibit signals in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, in the peripheral nervous system they block substance P, and in the central nervous system they block GABA. So when these two substances, substance P and GABA, are blocked, there will be an increase in dopamine. We know that dopamine is just prolactin inhibitory hormone. Okay, so prolactin inhibitory hormone, meaning there will be no production of prolactin, there will be no production of oxytocin. Okay, so that's the mechanism by which the opioids inhibit oxytocin secretion. It's by the release of GABA and substance P. Also, this substance P and GABA will cause increased production of dopamine, which is also called prolactin inhibitory hormone. So this prolactin inhibitory hormone will block the synthesis of prolactin. Prolactin inhibitory hormone. Okay. If the levels are high, if the levels of prolactin inhibitory hormone are high, it means the levels of prolactin will reduce, and also the levels of oxytocin will reduce. Okay. So that is the mechanism. So in summary, the factors that regulate and inhibit oxytocin are shown here: stretch receptors, suckling reflex, stretch of the vagina will stimulate oxytocin production. And then from the higher centers, the psychological component, we have anxiety, okay, will inhibit oxytocin production. Social cues, certain environmental factors, music, will produce oxytocin secretion. Okay, and oxytocin will move in the blood, causing these actions: breast myoepithelial cell contraction, uterine muscle contraction, increases uterine muscle contraction. But remember, progesterone and relaxin, they inhibit uterine muscle contraction. Okay. Also, maternal behavior resulting into bonding of a child with the mother. So breast glandular secretion, okay, resulting into production of more milk. So this hormone is a love hormone. Okay, it's a love hormone, oxytocin. So what are the actions of oxytocin? What are the actions of oxytocin? That is our part 3. It's important to know that it is involved in milk ejection from the breasts. It's involved in uterine contraction during pregnancy. It transports the sperms through the female genital tract up to the fallopian tube. It helps in ejaculation, that is in males. Okay. It helps in ejaculation like in males. Action of oxytocin at cellular level is the same mechanism of muscular contraction. Okay. This is a muscle cell. So this muscle cell can contract either through a hormone binding to its receptor. Okay. It can contract either through a hormone binding to receptor. So in the event oxytocin binds to the smooth muscle cell, it acts via this mechanism called the IP3 generation. Okay, IP3 calcium mechanism. So where the inositol diphosphate is converted to IP3, okay, and the IP3 mobilizes the calcium stores in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the levels of calcium increases in the cell. And then we know calcium activates the myosin, combines with camodulin. They form a calcium camodulin complex, which activates the myosin light chain kinases, and then it will facilitate the cross bridge formation between actin and myosin. So this is just the same mechanism of action which we discussed under muscle physiology. Okay. So these are the actions of oxytocin. It produces milk ejection, uterine contraction in pregnancy, transport of sperm through the female genital tract up to the fallopian tube, helps in ejaculation in males. So the drugs that are used to induce labor, they should have some oxytocin kind of properties. Okay. In case of there are conditions when labor is delayed, like for example, when do you induce labor if pregnancy has gone past the end of 42 weeks, which we call postpartum pregnancy. Also, intrauterine fetal growth restriction. Intrauterine fetal growth restriction, where the fetus is not growing properly. Those are the conditions when we can induce labor. So having preeclampsia, okay, preeclampsia we know is something associated with pregnancy complication characterized by high blood pressure and many other aspects. So we can induce labor. Also fetal death in the uterus. These are times when we can induce labor. And also high body mass index. A pregnant woman having a high body mass index, it can be risk. Okay, so labor has to be induced. So the administration of synthetic oxytocin can help, okay, to induce labor. Okay, so that is a mechanism of action of oxytocin.